Hi, and welcome to Celebration Bar Review's Top 10 Myths about the bar exam. And this week we're on myth number 5, so we're halfway there on the countdown. This has been a fun series for me to talk about the things that I see on a regular basis in talking to students, the sort of myth conceptions, if you will, about what the bar exam might be or might not be. And I continue to be thrilled by the reaction I'm getting from people who are enjoying this series. Well, if you've been watching, you know that number 6 on our countdown was about gaming the exam. It was titled Fool Me Once. And I talked in that particular discussion about people that really sort of tried to figure out all the quirks and oddities and ways to get around learning anything in order to pass. Well, in this week's myth, number 5, I guess I'd say it's the opposite. It's the I've got to know the law myth. And it really, it's a pervasive one because it just makes sense intuitively to most of us. We think bar exam, we think it's about the law, therefore the reasoning goes, I ought to know more law, or the more law I know, the better I'll do on the exam. It's a very subtle and in fact a very destructive myth, because what it fails to really recognize is that there's so much more to the exam than just being able to know or recite the law. Now, what I mean by that, if you're trying to get a sense of this, maybe it would be better to give you the illustration that I use often with students in the course, and that is that, for example, if you ever saw the movie Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman, or if you're a fan of the TV series, and I'm going to date myself now, Boston Legal, there was a character named Jerry Espenson who had Asperger's. In both of those fictional accounts, we had people who were very smart. They actually had the ability to be what we would think of as autistic savants. They could recite and remember any detail in a particular field, and you're all, I think, probably familiar with that kind of personality. The savant, the artistic savant in law, is someone who can recite the law by heart. And I've actually had the opportunity over the years to work with a few people like this. Knowing the law is not a problem for that person. They can know it, they can memorize it. Maybe you're someone that's got a photographic memory, and so you just know all the law there is to know. That all makes sense, and you'd think, wow, those people would do great on the exam. But the reality is quite the opposite. You see, just being able to know and recite the law is not really a prerequisite for success as a lawyer. And if you have any doubt about that, ask yourself whether or not you'd want Rain Man as your lawyer. I'd certainly want him at the blackjack table with me, but I don't think I'd want him representing me. In the same way, watching the character development of Jerry Espenson on Boston Legal, what you've actually found, if you're a fan of the show as I am, is that over the years he's gone from being just sort of this quirky oddity, funny character to a very nuanced, developed litigator, because they've made him more aware, more realistic, and less cartoonish about his knowledge of the law and his personality traits. The point I'm trying to make here about the bar exam is that too often people think that all they need to do is memorize the law. We'll talk about memorization later. It's one of my top 3 or 4 myths. But knowing the law, and simply knowing the law as the prerequisite to passing the exam, is a dangerous myth, because what it does is send people off in the wrong direction. If you think you're going to pass the bar exam by just sitting down and reading the law, learning the law in an Abraham Lincoln-esque way, you know, reading the law books, you're in for a real surprise. The bar examiners are not stupid people by any stretch of the imagination, and they are charged with the task of selecting and helping weed out those people that are not yet qualified to actually practice law. Now, many of those people are actually qualified to teach law, clearly, but think back to it. I mean, didn't you all have some law professors who you thought to yourself, wow, this person would be dangerous if they got in a courtroom? I distinctly recall my torts professor, who was a brilliant individual, absolutely, you know, megawatt brilliant, who, when a student asked something about how they would actually use res ipsa loquitur in a lawsuit, the professor literally pulled out the nutshells to read it, because they had never seen a courtroom. They had no idea how it would be used. They just knew the concept. You see, knowing the law but not knowing how to use it is not really requisite for passing or being a member of the bar. The examiners know that, and so they test in every jurisdiction in multiple formats. The multi-state bar exam, you might think, is a test of how much law you know. But in fact, it's really a test of how well you can define and make fine-line distinctions between one answer that's probably okay and three that are almost certainly wrong. You see, it's not just knowing the law. If you had memorized all the law in the 6 subjects of the multi-state, I can assure you that that by itself would not be enough to pass the exam. You have to know how to work quickly. You have to know how to discard irrelevant information. You have to be able to make those distinctions between two answers that reach the same conclusion but for different reasons. And that doesn't always turn on a question of law. Sometimes it's a question of application of facts to the law. For those who have to take essay exams in their jurisdiction, the essays are very clearly, in all the states that we work in, they are not a test of law memorization. They're a test of how well you can apply the law as you know it to the facts that are given to you. Do you have to get the law right to pass an essay exam? The answer is no. I've read literally thousands of answers that got passing scores where the law was dead wrong. That's not the primary thing that the examiners are looking for here. And in a course like ours, we're going to show you how to make the most out of what you know about the law. But imagine how it changes your study strategy. If instead of having to know all the law to be successful, you simply have to learn how to use the law that you know, it means that instead of cramming for hours and hours, instead of trying to memorize, instead of doing flashcards or thousands of questions, instead of driving yourself crazy trying to come up with mnemonic devices, instead of all of that, you start using your common sense. You start asking yourself, well, if I know this rule, the real question is, how would I apply it? How would I use it in practice? How would I use it to solve a client's problem? If you can answer that question, then I think you're well on the way to actually knowing and using the law and understanding it and expressing it to the examiners. And I think that's one of the most important things you can do. You know, very often I'll talk to a student who's writing an evidence essay, and it doesn't really matter what state it's in. And they will start off their essay by talking about the logical relevance of each piece of evidence, even though it's clearly not in dispute in that particular fact pattern. And I say, why did you do that? And they'll say, well, I was taught in law school, or I was taught in my generic brand, mega bar review that I had to say that. And I say, every time? Well, yeah. And then I say to them, imagine that you're in a courtroom and you stood up in your trial and you said, Your Honor, before I present every piece of evidence in this trial, I'm going to explain the logical relevance of it before I introduce it. Why is that, counselor? Well, because I learned in law school or in my mega bar review that we always have to talk about the logical relevance of each piece of evidence before we introduce it. Huh? Are you kidding me? How long would that person last in practice? And the answer is just until the time of the first golf game of the judge. It's not going to happen. And so if that's the criteria that you're using, that you're laboring under as you study for the bar, you are really headed down the wrong path. Now let me be clear. You need to know some law. But hey, here's the good news. You graduated from law school. You do know some law. All we're going to do in a bar review is update that a little bit, fine-tune it, narrow it down, show you how to use it. That's the real key of a good bar review. It's not putting it all into your brain so that you can spill it all over the 2 or 3 days of a bar exam. I know that's very disappointing to some of you. Some of you really wish this is all the exam was about. The problem is there's a name for you. It's called a repeater. And those are the really sad folks who tried hard, worked hard, did everything they thought they were supposed to do, and then didn't pass the bar because they didn't understand that the skill of discernment, the skill of being able to apply what you know, is every bit as important, if not more important, than simply knowing the law. Well, that's a tough message to swallow. You might want to chat with me if you're one of our students, or always welcome your emails at jackson@celebrationbarreview.com. Love to hear your thoughts about this, because I know that some of you are really committed to this sense of knowing the law, and it's an interesting concept when you start thinking about it differently. But think about it this week. Give it some thought. Try it. See how it feels to actually use the law you know and not just recite it. I think you'll be pleased with the results, and I think you'll be very pleased with how much you actually can learn. Have a great study week. We'll be back next week for the next in our countdown series when we bring you myth number 4 in our top 10 countdown. Thanks.